Hi everyone. Again, I apologize for having to step out of class so quickly the other day. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to go through the remainder of the slides that I had for the class. I'm happy to answer any questions. It's sort of challenging, as I'm sure you understand, to be able to do it this way because folks can't ask questions necessarily as they pop up. But please make note, send me an email. I'm happy to clarify, because if you have a question, likely other people in the class have a question as well. So just to refresh our memory, today we're talking about quantitative research designs. We're not covering qualitative today. We'll be covering that the following week. But where we left off was here. We started talking about experimental designs. And so as I had mentioned, typically, these are viewed as the gold standard in research. But it's also important to keep in mind that no one design is better than the other, but from a quantitative standpoint, we have the most confidence in our findings if we use an experimental design. Now, one of the biggest features of an experimental design is random assignment. Okay, so the idea of random assignment is you have a group of people and you develop a strategy for randomly determining who is going to be in a treatment group and who is going to be in a control group. The treatment group oftentimes receives your new intervention, whereas your control group receives either, sometimes it's a wait list we talked about in class, a wait list, or they'll receive treatment as usual. If they're receiving wait list, as we had talked about, oftentimes they will be on a delayed treatment group, meaning that they will serve as the control group unless the intervention is found to be effective, and at which point they will then actually receive the treatment. So I'm going to go through a number of different designs. What I need you to understand for this class is the essence of what is an experimental design. That is that there's random assignment to receive a treatment or to be in the control condition. I'm just going to be talking right here about a couple different experimental designs. The first one is the classic pre-test, post-test control group design. Now, there's some notation that we have to keep in mind. So when we're talking about quantitative research designs, R stands for random assignment, O stands for an observation, and X stands for an actual intervention. So if you follow the top row, you see that there's a process of randomization, there's an observation, right? And then we see that the treatment group actually receive the treatment, and then they stop the treatment, and there's another period of observation. Now on the bottom, we see there's a randomization, then there's an observation, but then the control group doesn't get the intervention. So you see the X missing there. And then another period of observation. And what we're looking at is after the actual treatment, do these two conditions, do they differ on that last O, right? So on the last observation, do they differ on whatever outcome we're interested in? If they do, then we have confidence that the only difference between these groups has to do with the actual intervention. We talked a little bit the other day about why wouldn't we give the intervention to everyone, and I used the example of Scared Straight. Here's a program, well-intentioned people with a well-intentioned intervention that not only didn't work, but it made kids worse off. So we want to make sure that our intervention works before we give it to everyone. The idea of double-blind, oftentimes you'll see those in drug studies where neither the participants nor the researchers know who is in the treatment or the control group. And so researchers will assign people to the treatment group and then others to the control group, and then you'll have outside observers that give these people a number of instruments to, measure different things. If it's a drug study, they might be measuring, blood, or they might be doing other types of observations. And so neither the actual participants know whether they're in the treatment or control group, and nor the researchers know that they're in the treatment or control group. So then there's the post-test only control group. Now, what you see here is you have your randomization, but then you don't have that first observation like we saw in the last one. Now, oftentimes we will use this type of design when we're worried that an observation will actually alter a person's behavior. So for example, if we're giving somebody a pretest on something, let's say it's a pretest on, I don't know, let's use the example of depression. But if we think that that pretest is actually going to alter how it is that they're going to score on the post-test, then we might not actually give them the pretest, because we oftentimes talk about this as sensitizing to the actual topic. So one of the, if you have a large enough sample, many of your agencies, if you're doing different types of evaluations, you're not going to have sufficient sample size to be able to do a Solomon 4-group design. The Solomon 4-group design, as you can see, it includes both the pre-test, post-test design, but also it includes the design that's only post-test only. So why is that helpful? Well, it's helpful because if we're concerned that potentially sensitizing might be an issue, we still get this this group that's not being sensitized, right? And so that's one of the benefits. But also, we do get the baseline measure, or the baseline observation from those top 2 rows from the classic pre-test, post-test design. Now, like I said, with what I'm sharing today, I'm trying to give you examples of different type of quantitative designs. I really want you keeping in mind that if there's some form of randomization to treatment or control group, that it's experimental design. I'm not as worried about whether or not you remember, oh, this is a Solomon 4-group design, or this is a classic pre-test, post-test design. So the next form, we just talked about experimental designs. The next one is a quasi-experimental design. The big difference between an experimental and a quasi-experimental is that with quasi-experimental, you do not have random assignment to treatment or comparison condition. Okay? So I've told you about the study that I worked on during my graduate studies. This was a quasi-experimental design. We had naturally occurring groups. So we had kids who were involved in the child welfare system, and then we created, as researchers, a comparison condition, right? So people weren't randomly assigned to be in the child welfare group or randomly assigned to be in the other group. These were naturally forming groups where we said, okay, we think these groups are semi-comparable, and so we're going to move forward with a longitudinal design, and we're going to follow these people over time. So just like in experimental design, there's a number of different types of quasi-experimental designs. The first one is a non-equivalent comparison group. We see that we don't have the R, so we know that there's no randomization, but we do have an observation, a treatment, and then another observation. And for the comparison condition, we just have observation, period of time, and an observation. One of the issues is that if we're not randomizing people to treatment or control groups, we don't really have any way of, well, we can test for it, but we can't really be sure that the groups are equivalent at baseline. Now, the last one here is, we talk about it as being time series, and I've seen this the most with things like policy analysis, where you have incremental observations that occur. So let's say that you're getting ready to implement a policy, and you could think about even at your practicum site. They want to implement a policy. So maybe you track things for a period of, 3 months in advance of the implementation of the policy. So you take an observation, you implement the policy, and then you continue to take observations. And what this allows you to do is to get a really good baseline, implement the policy, and then track it, any changes over time. So the last one, and I'm going to talk about this next week, this is the evaluation I'm doing with the Missoula Foster Child Health Program, is pre-experimental, or sometimes referred to as non-experimental designs. I use the terms pre-experimental and non-experimental interchangeably. You can use either one. But the big issue with these types of designs, they're fairly heavily critiqued for this, but there is no control or comparison condition. You only have the group of people who's receiving the actual intervention. So with the one group pre-test, post-test, you have an observation, you do an intervention, and then you have another observation. You can see the second one, or one group post-test. If you're worried that sensitizing might be an issue, you might just implement the intervention and then do an observation afterwards. Part of the problem with this one is because you don't have a baseline, you don't know whether your second point in time, your post-test observation, anything that you observed there, you don't know whether that's as a result of changes that occurred from intervention, because you don't necessarily have a pre-test that you can compare the post-test to. Then, well, this next one, the post-test only with non-equivalent groups, that's just very similar because you don't have an actual comparison condition. That one actually got thrown in by accident. My apologies. So that was the quantitative research designs. We have experimental, where there's some form of randomization. We have quasi-experimental, where we have a comparison condition, but there's no randomization. And then we have pre-experimental or non-experimental, where we have no comparison or control condition. So those are the big differences. Those are kind of the high-level things that I want you to take away from that. But next, a number of you for your actual papers have come across case studies. So I want to talk about single subject research design, and this is also something that you can use in your practice with clients as well. It goes by a host of different names, and this is not my doing, but it's the doing of people who have actually developed these ideas. They've come up with different notation than they did for the quantitative research design. So in single subject research design, A always refers to baseline. B always refers to intervention number one. And I say intervention number one because there could be a scenario where you would implement a second intervention, and we would call the second intervention C, the third one would be D, and so forth. Now, if you see something like B and C together, then that's going to suggest that people are receiving two treatments simultaneously. So for example, somebody might be doing individual psychotherapy and they might be receiving group therapy at the same time. So it would be noted as BC. And then you have B1 right there at the very bottom, B raised to the first. Now, this is for what we'll talk about in just a minute, changing intensity designs, where you're starting to alter the intensity or the frequency of a particular treatment. And I'm going to talk about an example in just a second. So, number of different designs. Once you understand the notation, then you can start to understand what these different designs are. The first one is B design. We try to avoid these because, as you can tell, this is just an intervention. Now, oftentimes we would use these, say, if you worked at a crisis facility where you don't have sufficient time to take an observation, you just need to do the observation. The problem with these is you don't really know whether or not your intervention changed anything because you don't have that baseline. Next is the AB design, so you have an observation and then you actually implement the actual intervention. So next is the ABA design. Here you're going to have a period of observation, you're going to implement the intervention, then you're going to stop the intervention and continue collecting information in your A phase at post-intervention. Now, why would we do this? We do this because what we want to try to understand is once we stop the intervention, do the effects that we've seen continue to last after the intervention has been stopped, or were the impacts only during when the intervention was happening? So the next is the ABAB design. So what we do here is we have a period of baseline data collection. We implement the intervention. We withdraw the intervention and continue to make observations, and then we implement the intervention again. And part of what we're looking for here is that pattern I was starting to allude to in the last design, which is, okay, so once we withdraw the intervention, do we see symptoms get worse or do they stay the same? If they get worse, then once we implement the intervention again, do we see symptom relief? If so, then we have more confidence that it's our treatment that is really effective for our client. So the next one is a multiple baseline design here. Multiple baseline designs, I always give the example of, let's say you have a client caseload, you're working with a caseload, all of them diagnosed with depression. Well, one of the things we know about depression is it can be cyclical with weather patterns. And so one of the things that you might say is, okay, I'm implementing this new intervention with my clients. I've got 3 different clients that I'm working with. But I want to understand whether or not it's my intervention that's really effective, or are there things like the weather that are going to make my client look better, right? Even though it's not my intervention that's working, but maybe we're heading into summer and my clients are just going to be doing better during the summer as it is. So you might use something like this multiple baseline design. So what you're going to do is at time 1, you collect baseline data on all 3 of your clients. Okay? And then at time 2, you're going to implement the intervention only for client number 1. For client number 2 and client number 3, you continue to collect baseline data. Then at time 3, you're going to implement the intervention for client number 2, but continue collecting baseline for client number 3. So what we're doing here is we're staging in the treatment. What we're looking at is we wouldn't expect that client number 2 would be improving at time 2. Okay, because they're still in the baseline phase. We haven't implemented the intervention. If we see client number 2 having symptom relief at time number 2, then we start to be curious about, gee, I wonder if it's something like the weather that's actually causing improvement for this client. So then we can have changing intensity designs like I talked about. So we have a baseline period. And then we have our B1, which B1 could be we're going to implement an intervention with a client in a school for 15 minutes per week. And then we're going to have B2, which would actually be 30 minutes per week. And then B3, which would be the same intervention, but maybe 45 minutes per week. So with the changing intensity designs, we never change the actual intervention. We only change the intensity of the actual intervention. Then we have actual changing intervention studies where we have a period of observation. We implement intervention B, which might be cognitive behavioral therapy, and then we stop cognitive behavioral therapy, and then we start intervention C, which might be, say, group therapy. And then we stop group therapy and we implement intervention D, which could be something like mindfulness-based training. So one of the challenges with these designs is, if you're not throwing any sort of observation in there, you don't really know how your client's doing over time. But also, if you're starting to throw lots of interventions into the mix, you can't really be sure which intervention it was that's responsible for any changes that you're seeing with your client. And then you have your combining intervention, like I talked about earlier, where you might start with a period of observation, you implement an intervention, and then you might add a second intervention. So you have maybe cognitive behavioral therapy, and then you combine it with group therapy, which is where you'll see the B and the C. Now, the single subject research designs, these are typically used, I see them used a lot in practice. They're not published a whole heck of a lot anymore, although a lot of you were finding single case studies. There are criteria that we use when we evaluate single subject research or case studies. I'm not going to read through all of this. It's fairly self-explanatory. But for those of you who have case studies as part of your articles for your annotated bibliography, as you're looking to mount your actual critique for your final assignment, this is the type of thing that I want you looking at, because this is how you're going to look at those individual case study articles and be able to look at, okay, how well are they doing with implementing the actual case study? So that's the actual content for this week. I realize I blew through it, and what I don't like about this format is there's not the interactive nature. You all had great questions last week. But what I want you to do, in addition to reading the articles for this week, okay, there's 2 articles, and I want you to just read through, and I want you to not necessarily spend a lot of time on the upfront stuff, but I want you to understand their method. And all these articles is to highlight how people use different quantitative research designs. But for your actual reading questions this week, it's going to actually be related to your individual project for this course. So for each of the studies that you included in your annotated bibliography, I want you to answer the following questions. What is the research design that they used? Now, for this, all I want you to say is they use an experimental design, a quasi-experimental design, a non-experimental design, a case study, or If it's qualitative, at this point, since we haven't gone through qualitative research designs, you just need to say, oh, it was qualitative. Okay, you don't have to tell me what type of qualitative research design it was. The second question is, what evidence do you have for your determination? Okay, so if you say that it's an experimental design, you need to describe to me why it is that you think it's an experimental design, or why is it that you think that it's a quasi-experimental design. So for example, if you have a quasi-experimental design, you might say, well, they had two groups, but there was no randomization that actually happened. They used naturally occurring groups. So that's what I want you to do for the actual readings this week, or for the reading questions this week. They're related to your actual study. If anyone has any questions about anything, if I can clarify anything, please let me know. Again, I apologize for having to leave class early. At this point, just a quick update, all is well. It was sort of a false alarm last week. It just had to do with the blood pressure thing, but everything is all good. I appreciate all your well wishes. Anyone has any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll plan on seeing you next week.